Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Gord Podcast. This is your host, Lord Gord. I'm giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. And take these broken wings and learn to fly again, learn to live so free. And we hear the voices sing, the book of love will open up and let us in. We're going to talk about broken wings today, on how ideologies break your wings. They take away your freedom, your autonomy, your desire to want to do better for yourself. So this week, I'm talking about some facts and fallacies about slavery and how the idea and history of slavery is weaponized by the left to grow the scope of government. So here we go, baby. Slavery today is often used as a reason to have big government in the United States of America. According to the worldview of the proponents of this idea, rectifying the wrongs of slavery requires a vast redistribution of resources through government. The proponents of this worldview are wrong in several ways, including the extent of slavery across the globe, the economic realities of slavery, and in regards to the United States, the effect of slavery on black underachievement. Slavery, at least in the United States, is used as a tool to enslave both whites and blacks intellectually. For whites, you must abdicate blacks of any responsibility for their aberrant behavior and be a willing slave for a big government that has every intent of expanding its power and eroding the rights of individuals. For blacks, you must always believe that all of your problems are the fault of someone else, wait for a Superman-like character to rescue you from your dysfunction, and believe that the only way to succeed is through various forms of governmental coercion. Now it's about time to shatter those ideological chains that lead people to believe such conclusions. So let me just give a very brief overview of slavery throughout humanity. Just very brief. To go into all forms of slavery, from Jews in slavery, Chinese in slavery, Indians in slavery, natives in slavery, blacks in slavery, whites in slavery, that will take a very long time, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview here. Slavery has been practiced for thousands of years among all races of people. All races of people. China in past centuries has been described as having one of the largest markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. And in the 20th century, under communist rule of Mao, a lot of Chinese slaves in those slave camps, they never get talked about. The word slave is said to come from the word Slav, as so many Slavic people were enslaved across Europe during the Middle Ages. And in languages like Arabic, their word for slave comes from the word Slav as well. What was peculiar about slavery in the United States was that the relationship was between different races. So when Romans enslaved Britons, they were both white. When Britons enslaved Irish, they were white. When Chinese enslaved other Chinese, they were Chinese. When blacks enslaved other blacks, they were black. So on and so forth. So the peculiar thing about slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and even in the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire, was that the slave owner was of a different race than the slave. Okay, so here's some facts. Okay, an even larger number of blacks were enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and Northern Africa than in the Western Hemisphere. This is why I always laugh whenever I see American black people with Arabic names. The fact is that more slaves were sold into the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire and to Arabs, like millions, were sold than into the Western Hemisphere. And the fact that they treated slaves far worse than we did here. They would castrate the men because eunuchs were worth more because they couldn't reproduce. And most of the slaves that were castrated bled out. But the fact that eunuchs were so valuable made it so that killing all those people was worth it economically. And also, black slaves in Islamic countries had a much higher mortality rate than the United States, which is why you don't see too many blacks in those countries now. And you see a lot of blacks in the United States and Brazil because here and in Brazil, so on and so forth, they treated the slaves far better. Even though in Brazil was closer to the African coast, so they received far more slaves than the United States of America. I think that when it comes to black slaves being bought and shipped to the Western Hemisphere, over half of them went to Brazil. So there's that. Okay. More blacks were kept as slaves in Africa than were sold to the Muslim Ottoman Empire or the Western Hemisphere. So you never hear about reparations from the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire because they're not stupid enough to give it to them. Everybody enslaved people. They bought these slaves. So the whole idea of reparations is nonsense because one, almost everyone was a slave at some point during history. And two, most whites did not own slaves. Only a select few. I think less than 10% of whites in America own slaves. And probably less than 5% today are direct descendants of slave owners. All right, so here's another fact for you. More than 1 million whites from Greece, Italy, and even the United States were enslaved in North Africa from 1500 to 1800. So more whites were enslaved by Northern Africans during that period than blacks were bought and shipped to the United States. Okay, yeah, we only hear about slavery in the context of black and white. And the reason why is because those people have a Marxist worldview. They have a specific agenda to paint whites as uniquely evil. And then they will propagandize other minorities to think that the only way that you'll be successful, the only way that the wrongs of the world will be corrected is you punish white people based on the color of their skin. And you install a dictatorial, totalitarian-style government that will redistribute resources while a small, concentrated government elite directs that vast redistribution of resources, and they will implement a new form of slavery called socialism. Let's keep this going. All right. So, for example, when we're talking about white slavery in Northern Africa, for example, Richard O'Brien, captain of the American ship Dolphin, was enslaved by North African Muslims for 10 years. And I believe the only way out was either escape or you convert to Islam. There's one guy in this book I'm reading about Thomas Jefferson and Tripoli pirates. He was a Scotsman and he converted to Islam and betrayed his people, and now he battles with the North African pirates. I forget his name though. All right. So when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams met with Tripoli's ambassador Sidi Haji Abdrahman, Adams asked how the Barbary states could engage in war and extort nations that had done them no ill will. Abdrahman told them, quote, all nations which had not acknowledged the prophet, Muhammad, were sinners, whom it was right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave, close quote. So in other words, the North African pirates were capturing and enslaving merchant ships that passed by them because the people who they were capturing weren't Muslim, and according to the Quran, you are free to enslave non-Muslims. Okay, this was late 18th century, early 19th century, by the way. So there was no U.S. foreign policy and imperialism to motivate the Muslims from imposing their ideology on innocent people. Okay. The Western world was the first to come up with the idea of slavery being immoral, and the British helped to eliminate slavery in places like Brazil and the Ottoman Empire. Yes, they would chase down slave ships. They would blockade ports that received slave ships, so on and so forth. And it really was the British and later the Americans that saw something wrong with slavery. No one else did. They still practice slavery in parts of Africa today. No one else did. Yet America is seen as a place where slavery was encouraged, and it was the only place in the world in which slavery was done, which is absolutely not true. And the question is, if you are a black slave, where would you want to be at the time and now? It wouldn't be in the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire. It wouldn't be with the Arabs. It wouldn't even be back in Africa. It'd be here. And it's really important to get this information out because there's just so much weaponized propaganda in the government schools, so on and so forth, about slavery. And that is done, like I said, to implement socialism, to implement totalitarianism, fascism. So beware of that. They're lying about slavery. Everyone participated in slavery, and it was the West that stopped it. So be proud of that. All right, let's talk about the economic realities of slavery. Slavery is seen as the reason for America's prosperity, but that is far from the truth. Slavery inhibits growth because it lacks the necessary incentives for efficiency and innovation. In the Soviet gulags, for example, over 50,000 slaves died a month in the year of 1942. Since Soviet guards could cook up any excuse, using Article 58, to imprison and enslave people, there was there's no mechanism to regulate the Soviet government from getting these slaves. There's no price that they had to pay for them. They were essentially free. Literally, the labor was free and you didn't have to buy them. It was free. And everyone knows that the less something costs, the more you'll consume it. Okay. So the gulag was so inefficient that despite the long hours of work, malnutrition, and other amenities not given to slaves, the free labor did not cover the cost of operation. The cost of producing bricks in a slave camp was more than double that of a non-slave Soviet factory. Woefully inefficient. Woefully. A study of Chinese slavery remarked that slaves, quote, did not generate any surplus, they consumed it, close quote. Brazil consumed more slaves than the United States, yet was underdeveloped when slavery was abolished there in 1888. Their economic development was largely spurred by immigrants from Europe and Asia. According to Alexis de Tocqueville, the states devoid of slaves increased their prosperity, wealth, and populations quicker than those that relied on slave labor. And the reason was culture and the incentives of the free market. You know, in the southern states that had slavery, manual labor was looked at as beneath most people. Because you had slaves, you did not have to economize. The labor was free. But in northern states, entrepreneurs had to buy labor only when they really needed it. And people took pride in working for themselves and doing well for themselves. So that's one of the many reasons why. The South was poorer in the North. The South was poorer than the North for whites and blacks. So in the Civil War era, the North produced 14 times as much textiles as the South, even though the South produced the bulk of cotton. 15 times as much iron, 25 times the merchant ship tonnage, and 32 times as many firearms. Only 8% of U.S. patents in 1851 went to residents of southern states, and only 9 out of 62 agricultural patents went to southerners, even though the South was where the bulk of agriculture was practiced. So in other words, slavery was not responsible for the prosperity of the United States. Slavery was inefficient. It was ineffective, and it encouraged not only the idea of sloth, but just a misuse of resources in general. You don't have to. You have other people to do work for free. You know, if you actually had to pay people, you have to mind your P's and Q's as to how efficient they are, how effective they are, and how they affect your bottom line. But when they're free, you don't have to do those things. So let's talk about, last point, how slavery fails to explain black underachievement. Now this is a huge one because you hear about legacy of slavery, and the reason why Detroit is bad, Baltimore, D.C., Chicago is because slavery. False. Slavery is used as an excuse for black underachievement and pathological behavior, yet many of the pathological behaviors didn't spike in occurrence until the 1960s. Here's another fact for you. Many blacks in America owned slaves, as about 33% of free blacks in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of black slave owners fought for the Confederate States during the Civil War. We're also told that the black family's dysfunction is a legacy of slavery, yet blacks in slavery had a higher marriage rate than blacks today in the United States, right now. From 1890 to 1940, according to census data, blacks had a higher marriage rate than whites. From 1930 to 1934, 31% of first births for black women were premarital, while from 1990 to 1994, 77% were. In 1960, for example, 23% of blacks were born out of wedlock. If that trend had continued, by about 1980, the illegitimacy rate would have been 29%. Thanks to the negative incentives of the welfare state, that number was well over 50% by 1980. Today, the illegitimacy rate is 77%. So how can, from the end of slavery, the blacks had a higher marriage rate than whites, and then today, their marriage rate is lower than what it was under slavery? How can that be due to slavery? It's a lie. It's a lie that's designed to protect blacks from looking inward at their pathological behavior, and to protect leftism and white liberals from the counterproductive effects of their so-called helpful policies. You know, they intended to help by incentivizing single motherhood and paying people not to marry the father of their children, and telling them that having loose immoral sex is the path to liberation and empowerment. Yet where that's practiced, you see death, destruction, murder, and mayhem. And all you have to do is say, hey, we blame slavery, and you just absolve yourself of any responsibility from the pathological effects of your ideology. It's really quite sick. So here's some more facts. 50 years after slavery, blacks in the United States accumulated over $700 billion in property and achieved a literacy rate of 50%. That is an incredible achievement, yet that's never mentioned in the government schools or the leftist press, because that would mean that black people can actually do stuff for themselves. Black people don't need welfare or affirmative action to succeed. They just need the incentives and deterrence of the free market. All they need is a government that treats them equally under the law to everyone else. More facts. In his book, The Negro in Business, Booker T. Washington reported that between 1860 and 1900, black home ownership went from a non-existent number to 22%. More facts. The biggest jump out of poverty for blacks occurred before the Civil Rights Movement. In 1940, 87% of blacks lived in poverty, and by 1960, only 47% of blacks did. Now, from 1960 to today, that number has went from about 47% to 25%. That's after affirmative action, $22 trillion being spent on 70, 80 means-tested welfare programs, trillions of dollars pumped into government schools, so on and so forth, and they still have not matched that level of achievement, because even as black per capita income has increased, the fact that single motherhood has increased so tremendously, and the number one cause of poverty in the United States is illegitimacy and single motherhood, that's why the black poverty numbers remain stubbornly high in the face of economic and social improvement. And if you're talking about crime, black crime as well as all crime have been falling for decades prior to the 1960s. Thanks to the Warren Court's lax policies towards criminals, crime spiked 139% in the decade of the 1960s, mostly in the North. For example, the violent crime rate in 2014 was higher than that of 1965. I also talked about Prices and Economic Freedom, my podcast on Prices and Economic Freedom, how from 1890 to 1930, blacks had a unemployment rate and a labor participation rate on par with whites, but because of New Deal policies that favored labor unions, Davis-Bacon Act, these minimum wage laws that priced people out of jobs, about 500,000 blacks lost their jobs in the Civil War. And these laws were passed to price blacks out the market. And because of inflation after World War II, in the late 40s, inflation had basically rendered the minimum wage useless, and black teenage unemployment was at the rate of white teenage unemployment, and their labor participation rate was at the rate of white teenagers. But as the minimum wage kept keeping up with inflation, you started seeing more and more and more black unemployment. So the average teenage black unemployment rate from 1970 to today is well over 30%. Even though in times with much more discrimination, though you couldn't imagine those kind of numbers. So a lot of these policies that seem good on paper are actually extremely destructive to blacks. The pricier you make discrimination, the less discrimination you'll get. And the less pricey discrimination is, the more discrimination you'll get. For example, if you have a double cheeseburger that costs $5, the single cheeseburger costs $2. Okay? If you want to save a little money, you'll get the single cheeseburger. If you want more meat, you get the double cheeseburger. But imagine if you passed a law that made it that the single cheeseburger and the double cheeseburger had to be sold at the same price. Which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the double cheeseburger because you're getting more value for your money. And this is what happens with minimum wage laws. When you artificially raise the set price for labor, discrimination costs less. If you have an inexperienced black and an experienced white, and the black says, hey, I'll work for half that, now your discrimination has a price. But if you raise the price of labor so that the inexperienced black has to sell his labor for the same price as the experienced white, you just kick that black out of a job. You just robbed him of an employment opportunity. So what I'm saying out and all is that slavery is universal. It was universal. It was practiced among almost all groups in the world. Blacks were enslaved far more in Africa and in the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire and by Arabs than they ever were in the Western Hemisphere in the United States. And compared to how they were treated in Africa and in the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire, we treated the slaves a lot better. There's no other place in the world where blacks have more economic freedom, more opportunities, more abilities to generate and keep wealth, and are wealthier and healthier than the United States. The United States is painted as uniquely evil, and our supposed racist history is the reason why blacks are unsuccessful today, which is not true. So I hope that this podcast enlightened you on some of these facts and having to change your opinion. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe on iTunes. Subscribe on YouTube. Leave a comment. Leave a review. Share it with your friends. Get the Lord Gord Funk album, This Isn't TV, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, so on and so forth. Donate on Patreon. Next week, I'm going to have a little surprise topic for you. So stay put for that. I'm Lord Gord. I'll talk to you next time.